To you. On the line with me this morning is Neal Thompson, all the way from Seattle, Washington. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. He got up extra early to do this with us. Neal, good morning.
Good morning to you, Todd. How are you?
Wonderful, and it's good to have you on the air with us. Hey, Neal, a couple of years ago, we went for our summer vacation to Boston, and we wanted to go to places that were not the typical places people go. So we found ourselves walking down a shady neighborhood street to the boyhood home of John F. Kennedy. And it was just probably my favorite part of the entire trip there. You've written this book, The First Kennedys, The Humble Roots of an American Dynasty. And so that really spoke to me, going to that house and then getting this book. It really is a tremendous effort by you to tell us the story, not only of the Kennedys in Massachusetts, but the Kennedys coming here from Ireland, and it's a tremendous work of scholarship right off the bat. I wanted to tell you that. This is a wonderful job.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was tell the story of where the Kennedys of Massachusetts actually came from originally and trace their roots back to Ireland and show what it was like for them to come from Ireland, mid-1800s, to America, settle into their own shady neighborhood, and try and start a life for themselves in America.
Well, indeed, they did exactly that. Of course, there are problems when you're trying to put together a book such as this and of that era, because documentation becomes a real issue for you. There are so many people who come over from Ireland in that time frame. Number one, or a lot of them share a name. Number two, the records just aren't kept up to date and reliable. You really had to do some research to get that first generation of Patrick and Bridget, didn't you?
Yeah, I sure did. And it created an interesting set of challenges. I mean, my background is as a journalist and historian and researcher, so I like this kind of stuff, digging into old records. But as I got deeper into this story, I realized there's just not a lot that's easily accessible for this original generation of Kennedys who first came to America. You know, they didn't leave behind their collected papers like subsequent generations of Kennedys did. They were just poor immigrants. So it was a challenge to kind of get into their heads as I was trying to depict what life was like for them coming to America on these dangerous coffin ships and getting settled in their immigrant neighborhood, surrounded by neighbors who didn't really want their kind, Irish and Catholics, in the neighborhood. And then, like you said, the Kennedys that I write about, these would be, I start the book focusing on JFK's great-grandparents, Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy. And Patrick and Bridget were two of the most common names in Ireland, and so figuring out which ones in these ship records that I was researching to figure out which boat they were on coming to America created some interesting challenges, but we pulled it off, and I think it's a sort of hopefully an interesting overlooked aspect of the Kennedy story.
Well, it certainly is, because what it does is it gives us the opportunity to understand what the overall Irish experience was getting established in this country and how difficult it was for them, particularly when so many of them are landing in one regional area and aren't accepted in the way that one would hope and in the romantic images that we might have of Irish immigrants here in America. It was a very, very difficult life. So many of them died so very young. Patrick did, as a matter of fact. Bridget did not. And her story, to me, becomes a really amazing when she seems to take a step beyond what would be the typical experience for Irish widows, who were so common in that area. She had something about her that enabled her to step up above what was the typical experience.
Yeah, she did, and I was glad to learn more about her and bring her story more fully to life, because she hasn't really been written about as much in the past, partly because of the lack of documentation that we talked about, but also because of the sort of the male domination of the story in later generations and into the 20th century. But in the 19th century, Bridget is this amazing figure in that family. Like you said, her husband Patrick dies 1858, leaving her with 3 daughters and an infant son to take care of. She's a poor immigrant widow working as a maid, not earning very much, but something about her character allowed her to believe she was capable of achieving more, even at a time and a place that didn't want poor Irish women to achieve more. They were supposed to just serve in domestic, servitude for their whole life. But Bridget moved her way up, became a hairdresser at a department store in downtown Boston, sort of learned that business and learned about commerce and customers, and then got to a point where she believed she could open her own business, which was extremely rare for that time. So she became a grocery shop owner, eventually bought out the building where the shop existed, became a landlord to the tenants who lived in the apartments above, and got her family to this sort of next level that many other poor incoming Irish immigrants and other immigrants weren't able to achieve.
And what enabled her, whatever that gene was that enabled her to step out of her circumstances, was evidently passed along to that infant son you spoke of. P.J. Kennedy turns into a very remarkable man, both as a young man. Starts work as a longshoreman and a stevedore, which was a typical path then, but eventually he works his way into becoming a business owner. He enters politics, if somewhat reluctantly, and if somewhat out of the norm for politicians of the day, and really becomes a revered figure and the true foundation of the Kennedys here in America.
Yeah, I think PJ is another fascinating character, and the book is kind of divided into those two parts. The first half is Bridget's life, and then the second half it picks up with PJ's life and his ascent into political power. And again, I think he's kind of overlooked in the sort of many books and many millions of words written about the Kennedys of the 20th century. His rise to power from almost nothing in the late 1800s is truly a unique and remarkable ascent. A saloon owner, a guy who just learned how to give back to his community, first as a businessman and then as a politician, and then became pretty influential in his day, working to kind of decide who got which jobs and who got elected to office all across Boston. He was really the first powerful Kennedy, and he's largely forgotten today.
Yeah, he is, but he should not be, and this book will help us to solve that. He becomes somebody who, rare in American politics, when he is finally off of the political stage, he is still so very well respected by those who were on opposite sides of debates and political wars with him, and those who were on the same side. P.J. Kennedy is revered, really, in Boston politics for the type of man that he was, and for the fact that he did so much work behind the scenes, which is really where he preferred to be.
He did. He wasn't the kind of politician who loved to be out there giving speeches and waving his arms around and campaigning in public the way some others did. And I describe one of those other politicians of the day, John F. Fitzgerald, who is John F. Kennedy's other grandfather. And Fitzgerald and P.J. Kennedy were had a complicated relationship because their temperaments were so different. Fitzgerald loved to be out in public kissing babies and that kind of thing. But PJ liked to work behind the scenes and actually just get things done. One of the things that helped this project and this book was early access to the P.J. Kennedy papers, as they're called, at the John F. Kennedy Library. These are letters and business documents that P.J. left behind that were really left sitting to rot at the Kennedy Library for nearly a century before the library finally processed them and gave me early access to some of those. And those letters really tell a lot about PJ's character. He was constantly writing letters to employers and politicians looking for help for some new Irish kid who came to America and needs a job or is down on their luck and needs a little help. So he was always working behind the scenes to do good work for the folks in his community. And you're right, other politicians and business leaders sought him out. They would come over to East Boston, the island across from downtown Boston where he grew up and continued to live, seeking his advice, seeking his input on certain political issues. So he became really the sort of the backroom influential boss of that part of Boston during his time.
We only have a couple of moments left with Neal Thompson, the author of The First Kennedys, The Humble Roots of an American Dynasty. I do want to touch on 2 points, though. First of all, is the fact that, and unfortunately we can only touch on it, PJ made a trip back to Ireland later in his life that really made a profound difference in his life and probably helped to shape the rest of the Kennedy experience here in America, did he not?
He did, yeah, and I find that trip to be a fascinating one because so much of his life was influenced by his connections to Ireland, his mother, his parents' connections to Ireland, their escape from that troubled country, and I think it's really what drew him into politics in the first place. And then he finally gets to visit there. This is years after his mother has died. It's his first trip back to his, family homeland. He sees where his father grew up and the family farm, where that's still part of the family to this day, in fact. Thanks to some support from Bridget and PJ, the family was able to save that farm and keep it in the family. So he sees what life was like back then. He comes back to America with this renewed appreciation for where he came from. And I think that sense of place and family and heritage trickled down through the rest of the family. Not all of them. His son, Joe, didn't necessarily care much about his Irish background, but others did, in particular John Kennedy.
And the other thing that I wanted to point out to folks as we talk with Neal Thompson in our closing seconds here is it was not an easy task for you to complete this book, especially at the time at which you were writing it. And I know that you really had to rely on some good folks to help you out to get it done. But by golly, you got it done, and it's a tremendous read. And I wanted to salute you for sticking with this project during this COVID era. It wasn't easy, I know.
It wasn't, no. It created some fun challenges. Thankfully, there's a lot of information online these days that I was able to dig for, and that helped a lot. But I think it turned out okay, and hopefully it brings to life these forgotten figures in the Kennedy saga, Bridget and PJ.
Absolutely. Neal Thompson, The First Kennedys, The Humble Roots of an American Dynasty. It's only coming out now. Boys and girls, get on board with this one. Neal, we appreciate it, and thank you for joining us in the darkness of Seattle this morning.
It is dark. I didn't even turn on the lights yet, Todd. Thanks for talking with me.
Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
It's Indiana in the Morning on WCCS. Morning on WCCS. Morning.